um, live on Facebook. Yay! We've actually broken through to virtual reality. We have broken through the virtual reality, Will, and we are with Will Allen. We've actually broken through to virtual reality. That's the virtual reality echo that was coming in there. But in today's webinar, Will Allen, who is a former White House, Air Force One, and Marine Two engineer, and together with a mutual colleague of ours who we were talking about prior to the program, Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the late Dr. Edgar Mitchell, who is much missed, have explored and verified ET Stargate wormhole technology. So that's what Will, who is coming to us from Washington, D.C., and who is founder and director of UFO-DC, and who covers a whole panoply. We were just having a discussion prior to the program on the face on Mars, and quite an expert. So perhaps at a future show, you can come back and take us a walk through life on Mars, or through monuments on Mars.
There's a colleague of mine that I would like to recommend also for that, and his name is Keith Morgan. Keith Morgan is probably one of the foremost experts in all of those formations around the face on Mars, and he was able to perhaps show that what they say are pyramids on the surface of the Martian surface are consistent with the pyramids in Egypt.
Or what? Sorry.
They're around the face on Mars are other formations which very few people even know about. One of them is the shape of a skull. The other are a series of formations which appear to be pyramids. And what's interesting about this formation of pyramids, they are exactly the same in alignment and placement as the pyramids in Egypt. And those are in the vicinity of the face of Mars.
Wow.
I don't know if I have that sample. I believe I might have that sample. But let's see. I'd have to find that sample.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We can do it at a future show.
Another time, and I would suggest definitely bringing in Keith Morgan with that, because
to
hear what this guy's got to say, it's extraordinary.
But today we'll be looking at, and we want it to be as objective as we can, because Will is, for those of you who have been to our prior programs and who know Wilbur Allen's work, he will be presenting today forensically authenticated extraterrestrial spacecraft and the manner in which they enter and exit our realm. And so this is, a verification and then toward the end, we'll go into some of the discussion of what does it all mean. And I had sent links to the webinar that we had with the people from Allies of Humanity, saying that, oh sure, there is an extraterrestrial approach or initiative going on now, but this one we should be wary of. And so,
they're saying approach, but they're not using the word presence. And from what I'm able to document, presence would be more applicable than an approach, because what the military was saying we should be aware of that's coming is already here.
Right. And and so we will then maybe after we go through a lot of the data, turn and gets Will Allen's observations on those issues. That is, what are we facing as a civilization, and what are the most wise decisions to make for human sovereignty?
You know, I found it interesting that the conditions and terms in which I did this research, very few even considered. Now, for 5 years, I would set up and put a camera on my roof and place it in the exact same place, same position, consistently the same every night. And for 5 years, in a region of space which was randomly picked in Washington, D.C., in restricted airspace P53, I would get anomalies that were and have been known by the US government, as initially documented in my presentation here as early as 1960, that these objects in which they claim to have been vapor trails are indeed extraterrestrial spacecraft, and they are in Washington, D.C. airspace.
Right. And you have said that they that they appear to signal to you, or you are some sort of a point of contact, and that they communicate to you.
I was a child abductee, and as on a U.S. military base in the United Kingdom in 1962. And at that time, I was essentially 5 years old, and this group of aliens in silver spacesuits, which had the physical structure to children, came into my room, and I found it interesting that my legs no longer worked and my vocal cords no longer worked, but I was able to consciously witness exactly what was happening to me. And they came up to me and implanted me with something. And from that point, for about 7 years, I vomited nightly because whatever they put into me, my body was trying to reject. And when the rejection process was completely, since my body could no longer fight it and whatever it is they put into me took place, now I find myself with this interesting little ability to photograph these objects, or they have a way of seeking me out and letting me know that they're there. It's a bit different than some people making that claim and not to have any physical samples. And here I'm showing you a plethora of data, all showing you consistently the same object. There we have a problem.
Right. And so so what you're going to be sharing with us are uh, the results of the monitoring that you've been doing.
Yes. And what's interesting is that everything that I'll show initially was documented in Area 51, Nevada, and Sedona, Arizona, and the North Pole. So in fact, it's kind of weird. Every place that I went, I've gotten the same objects, including Shreveport, New Jersey, New York. Every place I go, it's all the same. So it says to me that they're here. And if they can't be all following me at the same time, going wherever I go, it must possibly be that they're everywhere now. And some of the samples that were taken in the early days of the 1990s out in orbit, for example, the Tether incident, which showed there were thousands of objects out there, that those thousands of objects are here.
Right. And so um, there must be some sort of a law of non-interference that is at work here.
I believe there is something that's wrong because, for example, and we discussed earlier how some people want those spacecraft are going to be like a George Lucas Star Wars film with Death Stars and shaped spacecraft. That is not the case. And based on what I've been able to document, there's uniform consistency in these objects. It's also consistent with the material that Dr. Mitchell documented on the lunar surface. When I initially made the presentation to Dr. Mitchell, his response after seeing my first sample, he was stunned and speechless. And I didn't understand why he was stunned and speechless until he showed me EVA-1. And EVA-1 on the lunar surface during Apollo 14, while they were doing a lunar mission studying rock samples in the area in which they landed, this anomalous object, in which NASA described as a flare, was filmed on the video camera used by Dr. Mitchell. And I've got a sample. I'll pull it up to let you guys take a look at this. And it shows clearly, without a doubt, the same objects that I'm documenting here on Earth. Now, instead of being on the lunar surface, they are now here on our planet. They tried to say that was a glitch. That, according to NASA, was a glitch. Now, we've got samples that say that those are not glitches. That's not a meteor. And I've got multiple samples of this anomaly forensically documented in several flybys. And there are still people that believe that what I'm documenting are prolonged exposures. Well, how do you get a prolonged exposure while filming at 60 frames per second is a physical impossibility. And looking at everything in slow motion, you clearly see that's not a rock. That is a structure exactly the same as what was documented by Dr. Mitchell on the lunar surface, except this is flying by with some velocity. I do an extensive level of research on these things. I run the films in slow motion. I slow the film down to 6% its original frame rate, and we see things incrementally as they happen. And this, by far, is not the result of a prolonged exposure. So we're dealing with now physical documentation, and there's a ton of data. And most people, if you're interested in looking at this information, they can go to my website and just look up the chapter, which it's entitled Band of Light and Luminous Cylinder UFOs. They click on that chapter, all of the information will pop up. Everything is interconnected, including samples, which I'm getting in my new location in Manassas, Virginia, which are showing the same objects that I documented in Washington, D.C., are in the airspace in which I'm staying right now. So there's a problem here on this planet, and people are not seeming to be open or receptive to the fact that our airspace is not only teeming with aircraft that we make, but also aircraft that are coming from other planets. And the Russians knew that in 1989 when Phobos 1 and 2 were destroyed. And the last image Phobos 2 took was this luminous object, like the object Dr. Mitchell photographed on the lunar surface, like the object I just showed you fly by in the clouds. This anomaly by Phobos the moon is what destroyed those probes. And that was the last image both of those satellites took. So, you know, people need to wake up and take a look. I mean, we're being visited. These things are not small. They're quite large, perhaps larger than 2 or 3 aircraft carriers. And the data suggests that though they may look like a rock, according to NASA, as the sample here is on the screen, that's not a rock, it's a spacecraft. At least my data says it is. And I've got a ton of data that suggests that these objects, this is a sample taken from Area 51, and right here where my cursor is you see that dash of light. And that dash of light is on 6 different frames taken from the same perspective, because I fired my camera not to think to shoot video, but just to take a picture of stars. Didn't necessarily notice that whatever this streak of light is right here disappeared into the nebulae matter. And it's consistent with the other objects that I'm getting here. They appear and disappear, but what I think they're doing is they're using some type of quantum teleportation, which allows them to beam, like in Star Trek, massive objects like a spacecraft into any region of space they would like to go, or the very strong possibility that there may be a Stargate, a wormhole, or a cloaked mothership in our presence, and we just can't see them. But all the samples show everything is consistently the same. Infrared samples, which I was requested from me from NASA. NASA wanted to see infrared samples of the objects that I was photographing. I didn't have an infrared camera at the time, so I took one of my obsolete high-definition cameras, which is extreme rare, a D4 Nikon, and converted it to full-spectrum infrared. And at the time that I had this camera, it was one of the only cameras of its kind in the world. And here I document in full-spectrum infrared the same objects that I'm showing you, now documented with my D5 Nikon, which is a camera that has 4 million ISO. So I'm showing you with 3 different levels of camera technology the same things. Initially, when I presented the material, when I did the film called Uncovering Aliens, I had people tell me that what I was documenting was the results of slow shutter speeds. But there's a problem with that, because if it's a slow shutter speed, then everything would be responding to the slow shutter speed, including the stars, and the stars would show etching. But in the samples that I presented, there's no etching in the stars, because at 1 frame per second, which I used in Sedona, Arizona, and in Area 51, 1 frame per second at 1/20th of a second. For motion picture sync, it's 1/24th of a second. So we're only off by 0.4% of a second for sync rate for motion picture. So at 1/20th of a second, I documented this streak of light, which materialized in Sedona airspace. And I'll bring the sample up. This is the sample that I showed Dr. Mitchell. This is the sample that made Dr. Mitchell sit down, because he was completely taken away by the fact that here I'm showing him the same things that they documented on the lunar surface. People tried to tell me that that was the result of a prolonged shutter. Notice the trees light up before it flies by. So the same things, same long streak of light, everything consistently the same. So we started getting the evidence, but people disputed the evidence, saying, oh, it's a prolonged exposure. If this was a prolonged exposure, all of the stars in there would be etching. Why is it only the objects are etching? It's because it's a limited rate motion picture. It's not necessarily the result of something that was prolonged. And you see the same objects. Now I can end this and show you the same file taken at 60 frames per second. This is the object that just came out of the sky. Initially was enshrouded in cloud matter. And we don't want to bring Uncovering Aliens up. But the forensic evidence clearly indicates, without a doubt, that these objects are here. Here are samples taken at the Washington Monument. This is a U.S. Park Services camera. And I can show you tons of video taken from P53 restricted airspace, which was 4 blocks from the White House, which the Obama administration said did not exist, and show you clearly in high definition these objects. Same object that Grumman documented in 1960 is in our airspace as early as 2 nights ago. All the facts show that they're here. All of it. I have some really extraordinary samples. Like this is a full flyby. Unfortunately, we have ads, so I just wait for the ads to clear and clear them. I have people telling me, oh, that's a bug illuminated by light. Those are MUFON people telling me that, by the way. Now, This was taken in 2016. I can show you the same object taken 3 weeks ago in my new airspace. Consistently the same. My technology allows me to put virtual cameras into my film footage. So therefore, I can track the objects and look at them incrementally, frame by frame, as the data transpires on video as it's captured. So it's a level of analysis they have never even considered to look at, especially at a 3D level. So the technology utilized in the analysis of the objects that I'm photographing using high-tech technology seems to exceed those people that are the ones that are doubters and speculating that what I'm doing is fraudulent in terms of my visual presentations. I have a lot of people trying to be the naysayers, but none of them have been accurate at all in the assessment or the determination of the data that I presented. Most of them say it's not accurate, but I can show you 2,500 additional samples all showing the same things. And no matter how many samples I present to you, those very same people will say, oh no, it's constantly, it's an oh no. Now, that was 10/21/2016. Here's the sample taken less than 3 weeks ago in another airspace. So, for everyone that has the incorrect notion that what I'm presenting is not real, I need to wake up here, because there's nothing here that I'm doing. I'm not George Lucas. All I'm doing is translating the data that's being captured by my cameras, which happen to be extraordinary cameras, and showing that whatever these things are and whatever these people think that's not happening is indeed happening in our airspace. On the nights that I got these things, people went missing on the streets of DC. They didn't put one and one together. There's a problem here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I was muted, but the implications of what you're showing are very are staggering in some ways, especially the last thing. Are you suggesting that there's a correlation between the overflight and missing people on the streets?
Yes. Especially on the days that I image objects. There I started noticing the interesting consistencies. For example, I'm going to bring up a sample, two samples actually, and you're going to think that they're the same sample, but they're 3 years apart. So keep that in mind. I'm not showing you the same thing. I'm showing you the same thing different. I can't explain that. But on, I've got to find my page here. Where are we? Here we go. (504/2014). I want you to listen to this. There were two objects that flew by. You hear that whale sounding? 504/2014, 35 people went missing in Northeast DC. The trajectory of this object is Northeast DC. Notice the shape. This is inner space, mind you. Now I'm going to bring up the other sample. 105, 2017. Notice the shape. 105, 2017, 27 people went missing in the trajectory of this object, which was northeast DC. The 27 people that went missing, including their cell phone IPs, were in northeast DC. I made that report to the US, the DC Metropolitan Police Department, and initially they scoffed at the data and the presentation. And then I started getting DC police officers come to me and tell me that while they were on duty, they would see things, and the things that they would see would be 100% consistent with these objects that I'm presenting. Here's a sample, though, is a piece of evidence that will more than likely make your hair stand up, because what it shows is the same object that I showed you in the last two clips, but it shows you that this object simply appears. It didn't fly into the airspace as the first two objects did. This one appears into the airspace. And it's a clear example of what NASA was talking about in terms of how objects are using spatial portals to enter our airspace. Watch. You see it just appeared. It didn't fly into the airspace, it appears. It didn't fly in there, it just appeared. Flash forward. And in the reports that were given in the 1950s and the 1960s about aircraft that flew over the Washington US Capitol building, when the F-86 Sabres, which they launched from Bolling Air Force Base, which is less than 2 miles from the Capitol building, and in less than a mile of these objects intercepting these formations that were over the US Capitol dome, they disappeared, like gone. That's because they're using this technology to enter and exit our airspace. And I showed you with the first two samples, and you saw them incrementally materialize into the airspace, become solid, and then dematerialize. What's interesting is in some of the conditions in which I captured these objects, like the objects in the clouds for proximity, because we look at the ceiling of the cloud altitude and determine if the event is within the cloud. And I determine that the events are within the cloud by the fact that the level of diffusion that's presented in the presentation of in the film itself. Because if the object is in the cloud, and if you know anything about diffusion, diffusion acts like it diffuses the light around it. So you can see the energy that's being dispersed by these objects, and you see the amount of diffusion associated to them. The diffusion let me know that, okay, they're at 5,000 feet, 6,000 feet. We know exactly where they are based to the proximity of the clouds themselves in which the action takes place. So everything is done scientifically. And the fact that I'm able to document objects consistently allows me to take and put them in a folder which I'm able to do a comparative analysis. And in my comparative analysis, I can show you what they look like as they fly by, as they appear, as they disappear, what they look like when they're in semi-solid state, which in those cases, if they did fly by, most human eyes would not be able to see them. And all the conditions in which they enter and exit our realm have been documented. And it's all within the same fixed pool of analysis. So if you're able to get all this information in one region of space and not change anything consistently, then you can clearly conclude that these are not random, that these are not something that would be naturally occurring because of the frequency associated to them.
Is it, could they be, as far as what are your concepts of their origin?
Another galaxy, because I looked at, and there's a person that you must at some point try to get in contact with, is Dr. Kip Thorne. Kip Thorne's research relative to wormholes and what they documented on board Mir in the 1990s before Mir crashed into the atmosphere were these objects consistent with what I'm showing you, materializing in space, flying into the North Pole and exiting through the South Pole, which suggests that they're flying through Earth. There is indeed some validity to the hollow Earth theory, a very strong validity to that. There's also a very strong possibility that there are other civilizations beneath us that we just don't know anything about. And they're more advanced than we are, but they're beneath us. So we have to look at all of those possibilities. But for example, there was a report by Jaime Maussan, and there was a Mexican volcano, and they documented a anomaly like the objects that I'm showing you fly into an erupting volcano, flies into the volcano without any problem. So if they have that kind of capability, then indeed it's a very strong possibility that they could have bases in mountains, in solid rock, in the earth beneath us, miles beneath us, where we could obviously not exist without proper equipment to go down that deep. But they could be everywhere here right now and living among us. The data all says that they're here. I mean, I don't know what else to do other than to present the examples, and I'm showing tons and tons and tons of examples of the same things. But I've got examples like these two, for example, which I hope you could still see the screen. One is 8/15/2016. One is 8/14/2015. They show the same event technically repeating itself. And I can show you more. 8/15/2013, here's the same thing. How is it I'm getting the same things on a certain day every year? That suggests that whatever is transpiring has intelligence associated to it, that perhaps on these days that I documented these things, that they were supposed to transpire, and they did. That's the only way to explain how I can show you something from 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, and 2017 on the same day each year, same month, showing the same thing. I didn't make this stuff up. The camera is taking it.
One of the speculations was that the UFOs that overflew the Capitol during the Truman administration on July 26, I think it was 1948, was that they were from the Nazi secret space program out of Antarctica, and those were actually kind of flying saucers. Those, and that's one of the speculations there, that a whole group of people are floating now.
I have to disagree with that because it's technology that exceeds them. And I've got an anomaly, which after I show you this clip here, which I did an analysis of the 1952 motion picture footage, which people said was CGI. And those people claiming that it was CGI were absolutely wrong, because CGI has consistent frames, while this 360 frames required 356 frames of correction, which indicated to me it was handheld. So, I mean, all the data, you get these people who have the answers to everything and they're adamant about it. They're absolutely wrong, that they didn't do the study, the research to prove that otherwise. And I had people say to me, oh, these were reflections from street lights on the ground. Wrong again. I mean, everything that's presented, there's going to be the naysayers, and then there's the facts of the matter. And the facts of the matter clearly indicate that what these objects were plasma-based spacecraft. Those plasma-based spacecraft were the same objects Dr. Mitchell and I discussed, and those are the same objects Dr. Mitchell encountered on the lunar surface.
And so these are interdimensional craft.
They're way more advanced than we are. But if you look at the footage from the 1950s and the footage that let me show you from last year, the technology is the same. So they didn't advance as much as we did in terms of, if we look at how we advanced, but they're the same spacecraft. They're still here.
Yeah.
And I've got a high definition sample of these objects.
So that the hypothesis that those are like the Nazi Bell craft
Wrong.
from Antarctic, that Admiral Byrd that
what Admiral Byrd, that's interesting, though that report and the fact that part of the fleet was completely destroyed, so was the evidence associated to it. And that's when the treaties came about, where we couldn't go to the Arctic Circle or the North Pole, where you couldn't fly over it, because they didn't want you to see the fact of the matter. And the fact of the matter, according to Richard E. Byrd, was that there is some kind of anomalous hole, perhaps, or a portal which allowed him to go from the North Pole to the South Pole at the blink of an eye. And that's basically what he said he had the ability to do during his exploration. He went missing for 3 days and then reappeared.
Right.
The evidence, see, there were people that they didn't want anyone to know that extraterrestrials were real or any of this was real. When I was a child and I had this encounter with these little aliens that implanted me, which is the reason why I'm able to do what I'm doing now, the people that I told this to on the military bases dismissed it. And they essentially said to my parents that I had something wrong with my imagination, and that they essentially took me out of the normal children population, which I was telling the kids I'd made contact with aliens in first grade, and they put me in special ed. So from first grade to seventh grade, they made it possible for me not to say anything to anyone in a normal sense, to believe the fact that they knew that I was indeed had dealt with extraterrestrials as a child, because there would be no way a child could make up anything that I was telling these kids. And at the U.S. Capitol building on July the 16th, 2002, which was the same day as July 16th, 1952, when the objects flew by the U.S. Capitol building, on this day I got the same thing 50 years later, except this time I captured green spheres. So there's too many things, and they never talked about this, by the way. I have a picture of an object that landed on the roof of the Capitol building, and where it landed is where I have a problem, because they also landed in Taft Park. And in the area where they landed in Taft Park, you see these two oval impressions in the ground. Nothing grows there. So if nothing grows there and they touched down on the roof of the U.S. Capitol building, and in the area where they touched down are offices where people work, then whatever radiation was associated to these objects that landed on the Capitol building was translated onto the building itself. And the people in those offices perhaps became sick from unknown reasons, with some unknown abstract illness associated to an extraterrestrial spacecraft that landed on the Capitol building, and nobody seems to want to care about it. So there's a lot of collusion here. I'm surprised that, they're trying to keep a lid on something that's much bigger than they can handle. And there are too many people with smart devices that are able to document these objects and are documenting these objects. And even that is being dismissed. So, we're at a point in the juncture in life where, what is it that I have to do to prove to people that we're being visited by extraterrestrials? And I'm showing you proof photographically, showing you proof in high definition. I'm showing you proof using IMAX technology. I'm showing you proof using full color night vision, full spectrum infrared, which is more advanced than Hubble, showing you all of these samples. And yet I still have people dismissing and disputing the validity of an example that I'm presenting, claiming that it is because of a prolonged exposure. Well, what do? You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't in this industry. This field.
Now let me get these facts right. It was 37 people in Washington, in northeast Washington, D.C. went missing
On 105, 2017, 37 people went missing. And
in,
what's interesting is, and their cell phone signatures vanished also. You
yeah,
know, cell phone lets you know where you are. When that signal vanishes, I mean, even if you take the battery out of your phone, you know your cell phone will still tell people where you are, but that signal disappeared. And it's ironic that the nights of these disappearances, that I imaged objects materialize in the airspace above my home, and all in the direction trajectory wise of Northeast DC. And this is where all the people were missing.
now that seems to be a deliberate escalation because the U.S., Washington, D.C. is meant, it's kind of considered to be one of the world city-state capitals, and
What better place to visit if you were an
they're
alien?
taking 37 civilians from one of the world's city-state capitals, like the armed that has military bases all over the world. Like this city-state capital has military bases all over the world.
You know, those bases mean absolutely nothing. These things can enter and exit at will in front of them. They wouldn't even know when they're here. The only time they show up on radar is when they materialize. I mean,
But it seems like the the strategy behind whatever intelligence abducted those people appears to be to try and cause a panic in the human
it's not doing that. Instead, they put another twist to it. They'll say, oh, they were teenagers that ran away, or, you know, they come up with everything but the realities of the matter. And the realities of the matter are that on the days that these people vanished, I documented objects bigger than aircraft carriers materialize into the airspace. And those samples I showed you, they're taken with 20 millimeter, 40 millimeter, 50 millimeter lens, which means they're like normal vision perspective. How big were they? They would have to have been at least 2 or 3 aircraft carriers in size for them to register like that on film. Big. But yet, and I saw one of them fly by on the street, mind you. I saw it fly by, I saw it vanish. So I've witnessed these things. And I still have people saying that
Yeah.
they're fraudulently generated.
Now, that looked kind of like a cigar-shaped vehicle.
Like a suppository. It looked exactly like, and it was massive. And what I saw was round. If you're familiar with an aircraft carrier, now if you made an aircraft carrier round, it was like that, like a huge aircraft carrier, round, except it was completely round at both front and back end. And it didn't have no windows, it didn't have doors, markings, or anything like that. It was a luminous anomaly. And in my opinion, it had the consistency of plasma.
Of what?
Plasma.
Plasma. Now,
Plasma.
are those supposed to be reptilian ships or not? Or some
From what I understand, when I did this research, and I did a lot of research on the craft itself, and somebody in Germany sent me this information, and I was completely taken away from it by the fact that here, the day 105 2017, the last cylinder object that I photographed and showed you at Whole Foods, I saw a table with 18 blonde, what I called supermodels, because they were all stunningly beautiful. They were so fine that I started babbling. And I thought it was odd because I've never been taken away by and afraid to say something to somebody so absolutely gorgeous. And it was every one of them, believe me, if it was legal, I would have married all of them. That's how gorgeous they were. And then look at this graphic here and the spacecraft that they're supposed to be flying. So quite naturally, my reaction at Whole Foods when I started babbling, when I knew something wasn't correct and I couldn't make a correct sentence, that these were not conventional people, women that I was looking at, and they were absolutely stunning. When I say stunning, they were Farrah Fawcett Major Fine. They were absolutely gorgeous.
Now, yeah, so was that how they are, or was that their like disguise?
Honestly, after, you watch Odo and Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and they have the ability to morph into anything.
Yeah,
I believe, first of all, what I was seeing could not have been real, because even though, I'm a man, and if I see a gorgeous lady, I'm can't say anything now because it becomes sexual harassment. But I couldn't say anything to any of them because a level of fear came upon me that I couldn't explain. Inside me said, "Oh no," and I started babbling. So to me, it could have been an illusion I was looking at, and they could have been indeed reptilians that shapeshifted into these stunning babes.
yeah, yeah. Because why would an advanced civilization go to, on January 5th of 2018, go to northeast of Washington, D.C., the city-state capital of the military state of the world, of the military country of the world, nation state of the world, and abduct 37 people like that?
What's interesting is how they were abducted. When a person says vanished without a trace, how do
Yeah,
you vanish without a trace? And then that without a trace comes because the cell phone, the IP that's associated to your cell phone, which, by the way, if you take the battery out of your phone is not dead. It still sends out a signal as to where it's located. So even that signal vanished. So that said to me that for a person and their cell phone signal to vanish would mean that they would have to be taken up into an area which is shielded, and inside that spacecraft is shielded. So nothing goes in, nothing comes out,
yeah.
especially a signal.
And so one can only speculate what is the strategy behind the intelligence of that is doing that,
Well,
because
it's the demographics of what they're doing that's even more compelling, because of the 37 people that vanished, they were all young African Americans.
yeah,
Now,
yeah,
they mysteriously vanish, and then there are millions of African Americans that vanish in the United States. It almost appears nobody seems to care about. And we can't say that because they're African Americans, they don't care about them, but we can say that because it's obvious they don't care about them. And for me to make the statement that I believe that those people who went missing, or that are going missing, are being abducted by extraterrestrials, and for them to take that as uh, trivial or as delusional or as something that would possibly be said by a person that has signs of mental or psychological instability, that to me was an insult and a slap in the face, especially in the fact that here I'm showing you clearly the events that are transpiring, and on the events as they happen, the camera documents a date stamp associated to it. So I have the exact time and date in terms of which the events take place. So if I'm able to document the exact time and place in which the events take place, and then other events take place simultaneously as these events are taking place, then you can conclude without a doubt that there's one connection that's associated to another, and that these people who have mysteriously vanished, and that these objects that mysteriously appeared and then disappeared in our airspace are the results and the reasons why these people are going missing.
and you don't think that there could not be a COINTELPRO explanation of, of
Other than I would believe that the government may be in collusion with these things, that there is some kind of a mutual understanding in which our government is allowing these events to take place, then logically speaking, that would be the only conclusion you could possibly have.
yeah,
And that is all, and it's not based on speculation here, because I'm saying things based on a level of evidence in which I'm able to document. I can authenticate what I'm able to document, and I can't verify why these people are going missing on the days that I document these objects, but I can form a conclusion based on all of the samples that I have, and on the days that I document these things, X number of people go missing. So
Well,
where we take this, I don't know.
yeah. Now, the thing is that we know that the written agreements, the treaties, the secret treaties that we've heard of in the literature between the United States and ET civilizations have all been on the reptilians' side. The 1954 Greada Treaty that Eisenhower signed was with the Draco reptilians, the Orion Greys, and the Anunnaki reptilians. That was later amplified in the Tau 9 Treaty, signed by George H.W. Bush, with the same parties, with the Draco reptilians, the Anunnaki reptilians, and the Orion Greys.
There are the non-corporeals also. And see, what I documented at the U.S. Capitol building, most people, say in the early days, would possibly have perceived them to be spirits or ghosts, but the fact that NASA confirms the ability of a non-corporeal entity, a non-corporeal life form does indeed exist, I documented that they are valid also, and that those could possibly be what the theologians would have interpreted as demons and spirits and ghosts, things like that. They were actually extraterrestrials.
Yeah. And the first treaties that we know of was signed by Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s in Balboa, Panama, and that was with the Orion Greys, who were fronting for the Dracos. And then in 1948 by Truman again. So,
but see, all of those people that did all of that work, they've disappeared. And so that mindset, since there was no documentation like the internet or anything like that, for those people who are in tune with things today, they're clueless about what happened in the past.
yeah.
And the information you possibly would say, they would have dismissed it, because there's no documentation associated to it. There's no proof of it. There's no proof of the Roswell crash. There's nothing other than pure speculation and what's put out there through hearsay. So, the problem basically is the lack of information and the reaction people are having from information that's put out there that's essentially fake news, false flag type information. It's mind setting. It in fact makes you think that there's some kind of game going on to keep people from opening their eyes to the validity of the fact that extraterrestrials are not in our airspace. They are here. They have bases here.
Yeah, and what's worrying is the evidence that you've just presented for 2018. The fact that there appears probable cause evidence that 37 people, civilians, were all of them of a specific targeted group, appear to have been taken without a trace back up into a cigar-shaped plasma ship. And the signature of those ships, trace back to 1952 at least.
Earlier than that, 1940s, 1930s. There's even reports of it from the 1890s. So Christopher Columbus saw something come out of the water. I mean,
and do you get a beneficent intent from the intelligence behind this approach? I mean, this kind of presence or whatever it is?
You know, they let me document them to an extent, and the extent in which I'm presenting, because it's all consistent forensic evidence. And they let me know they're there. They let me know when and where to focus. You know, and I have to show this sample, but on the other night, I think it was on the 23rd, I ran a reflector, which is behind me, which is a 5,000 millimeter lens, and I aimed it in the direction of Washington, D.C. And it took 3.5 hours of time lapse of airspace. And in the 3.5 hours are two objects which maintained 100% stationary positioning. Got to show you this. And I had Dr. McAbee take a look at it, and Dr. McAbee wanted me to check to see if it was a hot pixel in my camera. But I had to point out to something to Dr. McAbee that because this is a reflector and it's on a balance, which I don't know if you can see it behind me, but it's a 40-pound reflector. And on the other side of the 40-pound reflector is 42 pounds of weight. So it's a balance, like a very intricate device. So it's balanced. If there's a little bit of wind, the wind will cause image instability and you'll see the bounce. In my samples, when the reflector bounces, and the two lights which Dr. McAbee assumed initially before I showed him the fact that these are indeed stationary objects, when the wind blew the reflector, all of the stars went up and down. You could see the motion associated to the translation of energy. When you see wind blow the lens, it's forcing the lens to move, the vibration. And if they were hot pixels associated to the camera, the two spots would have been stationary while all the other lights would have been bouncing from the vibration associated to the reflector being blown in the wind. But in the sample, as the reflector is blown, so are the stationary objects. So I've got to show you this. And it was interesting that it was one of the, here we go. Here, you see these two objects here? Watch them. This is time lapse, mind you. And gotta get rid of these ads. When the camera moves, you see how the camera moved and you saw there's motion associated to that? Those are stationary objects. That's something not being generated by the camera. Cameras don't manufacture light. Cameras record light. And here I've got two stationary lights in airspace focused at Washington, D.C. with a 5,000 millimeter reflector. And they're not moving. They're stationary. Look, this object almost intersects with it. And you see the motion. You'll see there's when the camera bounces. And if you look at the overall action on the frame, you'll see that as the stars bounce, so do these two stationary objects. That's because they're stationary. It's not something that's being manufactured by the camera. That is a physical impossibility. Whatever these objects were, they maintained permanent stationary positioning. That is an impossibility with any known technology that we have right now. This was taken 2 nights ago, 1/23/2018, over Washington, D.C. airspace. It's a 5-minute video. In 5 minutes, these things don't move. If the lens bounces, they'll bounce along with it as a reaction associated to the wind being blown on the reflector. But other than that, they're 100% stationary and they're sitting above Washington, D.C. People would see them and think they were stars. You see the motion? So when it bounces, so do these. If this was a hot pixel in the camera, these two spots would be 100% stationary. They're not. These are moving along with the actual stars. The stars are moving, but these two objects are not. You see that? So the evidence for those who are the naysayers who are saying that, oh, this is a hot pixel. If you look at it closely and you know how pixels are stationary in a camera, And why are my pixels bouncing when the rest of the other objects are bouncing when the wind blows it? That means that they're imaging what's in front of the lens. They're there. It's outside the camera. It's not inside the camera. And that was a few nights ago, 1/23/2018. It was 4 nights ago. And that was 3.5 hours of video in time lapse. And each camera, the camera's taken a frame. It's 1/40th of a second, which, because I'm using 102,000 ISO, it gives me a really nice fast shutter speed. So time lapse doesn't necessarily have to be a long exposure. So with the shutter speed that I'm using over a course of 3.5 hours, here I presented 2 anomalies in the sky, which have the same visual consistency of stars, which people on the ground would have considered stars if they saw them, but perhaps would not have noticed the fact that these stars were 100% stationary. You ever heard of a stationary star? That's impossible. Not unless it's in orbit, stationary, like a satellite. So the other thing with the objects that I'm photographing, the streaks of light, NASA has samples of them in the rings of Saturn. So we have samples from the rings of Saturn which show these objects that are consistent with what I'm showing you here. There's even footage taken from the little rovers on the Martian surface showing you the same objects. So whatever they are, they're everywhere, and that these devices that we have, in terms, at least my technology, is able to capture them and on a consistent basis. I did other research. I also took my infrared camera, which is a hybrid of Hubble, and pointed it towards the lunar surface, and was able to locate and determine that there's some kind of atmosphere on the lunar surface, and that there is a energy source, a light source within this crater that's not natural, and that this camera, being infrared, is telling me that whatever this light source is in this crater, is that light is an infrared range of visibility. It would not be seen normally by a human eye. So all the evidence is very compelling. You can see that there's a hot spot here in the center that says to me that the light source is extremely intense at the center of this crater, and that there are other light sources in some of the craters, but not as intense as the light source that was in this crater. I've got to wait for the blue moon that's going to come up, I believe, in the next couple of days. And I'm going to set my infrared camera on the lunar surface and film it at, and I'm using 1/8,000th of a second for extreme freeze action capability. If there's any action or anything moving on the lunar surface at 1/8,000th of a second, there would be no blurring associated to it. Therefore, we would have a good representation, unless this object is moving at a much greater velocity than the shutter speed that I'll be using to do the actual research when I do that on the lunar surface.
And would one of the hypotheses be that would be a portal to the inner structure of a civilization that would live?
Or it could be there's something there that's using infrared light to mask human detection.
Oh, I
and
see.
that because we can't see infrared. So if you look at the moon and you look at this area, you see nothing. It just looks like a crater. But I'm using Hubble is 1600 ISO, by the way. This infrared camera is 200,000 ISO, so I have a lot more light sensitivity and light gathering capability than Hubble. And that this clearly indicates that whatever light source is on the lunar surface was greater than the range of the rest of the lunar surface in terms of the exposure for the lunar surface. For me to get the actual exposure of it, you have to have it within a certain range so you can see the definition and details associated to it. But in this one crater, I could see that, especially when I did a monochromatic black and white of it, that there's a hot spot right there. There's a hot spot on the lunar surface. and it's not visible to the human eyes. This is infrared. And I don't think they've done an infrared analysis of the moon. But at a more, I want to get a lot closer. I've got to wait for the supermoon to do that. And I've got the technology to apply programming and allow my camera and my reflector to track the moon or any spatial object once I get the computer systems online. I'm building a system here that's comparable to what NASA can do. In fact, it does have some of the advances as NASA, and that the data that I'm able to gather with the technology that I'm utilizing indicates clearly that there is an extraterrestrial presence in our airspace, and perhaps on the ground.
So this is forensically verifiable evidence.
All of it. That's the approach in which I utilized to put this presentation together. In each folder, I would put like objects and the consistency of all objects, you know, based on the visual definitions that I'm able to document. And I put everything in a folder. And when you start seeing your folder getting larger and larger and larger, and I'm telling you, this folder has 2,700 samples in it. 2,700 samples over a course of 5 years. Now, if we do the math, that would suggest that they have there's a very high probability that whatever it is that I'm documenting is either based here, they have a overt interest in the areas in which I'm doing this research, because the presentation initially from Washington, D.C. is in a fixed airspace, and that fixed airspace is 4 blocks from the White House. So 4 blocks from the White House, I was getting UFOs, while the Obama administration was saying they didn't exist, and there was no documentation associated to even going out and making a statement by the president to say that they do exist. And they blew it off. They blew all the data off. But 4 blocks from the White House was saying the exact opposite of what the White House was telling NBC News, that there's no presence. But yet 4 blocks away, there's a total presence. Who do you believe? My cameras or some guy sitting at a desk with his iPad in the White House? I have a problem there, because the guy sitting at the desk with his iPad at the White House is a BS artist. And, you know, he's paid to blow the smoke over everybody's eyes. He's supposed to be the science advisor, but the science advisor is going to say there's no forensic evidence to authenticate the validity of an extraterrestrial presence in our airspace. And here's a guy 4 blocks away saying that there is extraterrestrial presence in our airspace and documenting it. And the White House says, oh, no, it isn't. And then there's the U.S. Capitol building in 2002 and 1952, which they dismissed that data also. So who are we believing here? Are we believing this guy with this iPad who's the science advisor? You know, I want to know where he got his degree in science, because he must have got it online at some shady university where he can get a PhD for $200, because the data from my cameras, and I'm using various levels of high definition Ultra HD 4K cameras, all the data is the same. So it can't be a glitch in all the cameras. It can't be something wrong with the technology that I'm using. It can't be the technique that I'm using, because I'm using cinematography, and I'm a master cinematographer. So what is it we're dealing with here, and what am I documenting? And why are these people telling me that it is other than what the evidence shows that it is?
Now, the apparent mass abduction event took place on the 5th of January, 2018, under a new U.S. president.
So those are I believe that was 2017. The samples I showed you, those were all under the Obama administration.
Oh,
now,
so,
I tried diligently, because I'm a Republican. Keep in mind, I was Ronald Reagan and George H. Bush's engineer on Air Force One.
oh,
They let my contract go when I worked with Bill Clinton, because the differences were I'm not a Democrat, and, you know, we just didn't see things the same way. But nevertheless,
right now, but if I could ask you, so that the 37 people abduction incident was the 5th of January of 2017.
2017, 2017.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we had that 2018. I'm here in another location. By the way, I don't know what I got on that date, but I believe I'd have to go to my YouTube channel for that data. Let's go here. Video.
Oh, so you could say that if the ETs were playing politics, they have not done a single abduction in the new.
I couldn't say, but you know, on 108 2018, I'm looking at my YouTube channel, and one of the things that I'm able to do when I do this is making me look right. So let me go back to my other page. Is it's time date. So you know, I can show you the dates every year,
Yeah.
and on certain dates every year, if I pull data from just those days on the same day of each year, it's the same. Like almost as if somebody took and rewound the tape and played it again, and rewind the tape, play it again, rewind the tape, play it again. It's the same. I've taken a file from 2015 and 2016 and overlaid it. Even the velocity of the objects is the same. The trajectory is the same. Everything is the same. It repeats. So I initially thought, since I concluded there was a spatial portal or two spatial portals in my airspace research, that there could also possibly be an anomalous condition in time, which exists outside of time. You know, we're existing in a normal reference time point, while outside us, other things could be happening in another time frame. Meaning, it could be a time warp that I'm documenting, showing the same objects on the same day every year consistently. You know, when you think about what do you think the probabilities of you going outside tomorrow and then the same day next year and on the same day the next year and on the same day the next year and on each of those days you get the same thing? That's not probable, but my data shows that it is happening.
Right.
So we're dealing with something a little bit more aggressive, and something that perhaps deals with the augmentation of time and space, along with the validity of bringing these spacecraft into our airspace.
And again, you've ruled out that these are holographic projections.
Holographic projections don't have sound associations to them. See, that's the other thing. The cameras that I'm utilizing are using 7.1 DTS surround sound technology to record audio, meaning I can record everything in a three-dimensional perspective where left, center, right, and all of the spaces in between are surround sound. So I get these objects, and when they materialize in the airspace, the sound associations to them also travels with them. So you're able to tell from the sounds where they're materializing and where they're going. And you can hear that if you use headphones. You can hear those spatial associations associated to those files. So when they do enter into our airspace, they have a sound, and it sounds as if it has that low end rumble you would hear in a sci-fi film when you're on board a spacecraft. You hear this low end rumble. You can hear the low end rumble as they're entering into the airspace. And then you hear the sound associations to their propulsion matrix as they fly by. So it's not like anything that I have recorded on a conventional level. And I've recorded a lot of things, and the sounds that I recorded from these objects are unlike anything anyone has ever heard. The closest thing one could possibly make the comparative sound association to it with would be that to the sounds of whales. But to me, it sounds more so like a nuclear reactor of some sort. It has an unusual sound association to it. Then there's the nuclear green contrail that these objects have when they fly by. So there's too many consistencies, at least based on my analysis, that I'm able to show that are all associated to these objects. And that when they do appear, that's when people disappear. That's all I could possibly say. nobody seems to care. And more so, I think they don't want to know why they're disappearing as to how they're disappearing. And, you know, if I'm able to show you UFO, which they're dismissing, and show you the time date references to it, which they're also dismissing, and show you that on those same time date references and then the direction of which these objects are materializing, that people vanished in the direction of these objects in which they were in their trajectory associations, then easily you could conclude just from the evidence that's presented that there's a very strong possibility that those people didn't simply vanish, but were taken on board an object and taken off world for some other application, if not for a meal.
Well, that's an unwarranted interference with their free will.
That they have no regards for you. They don't have. They're above the law. They are the true illegal immigrants, illegal aliens.
Yeah, and this is my point: is that these secret treaties, for example, the Greada Treaty, and we don't know the exact content.
We could have let these people, these aliens, take these people for all we know. It could be part of the agreement.
Yeah, exactly. And this could be part of the agreements under Greada, under Town 9 treaties that were signed by Eisenhower, that were signed by Roosevelt, that were signed by George H.W. Bush. And some of the word on the street is, oh, well, once they were signed, the reptilian side just walked through them. You know, they just used, I mean, the humans were just like overwhelmed and the reptilian just walked through them.
Well, there's now, we're looking at the possibility of overpopulation. And, you know, maybe in their mind, the best way for them to stem the tide of population is to let the aliens take them.
Well, the thing is that I believe that it's a lot more sinister than that, because on one side, there's a line of research that we've been able to document, and you can go to newsinsideout.com, and that is that the Greada Treaty, among others, seems to have cemented a planetary, solar system, and galactic market in children, pedocriminal market. You know, there's the Dracos. I mean, there's a trade in human children from Earth. There's a trade in human beings, maybe for the slave market, maybe for the food market. We don't know. And then there's the soul market, the loosh and the soul, and all of these are markets that
everything is sellable. Your spirit, they can sell your spirit. It's an energy which can be extracted from you.
Yeah, and these are markets that the reptilian side, going back to the Lyra Draco wars, and you know, the diaspora of humans from the constellation Lyra that we're kind of a product of. That's the main theme, is that and so
we're a commodity.
Yeah,
and so we're being sold as such.
Yeah, and so we have put forth, you know, since President Trump has the power, we said, well, let's approach the U.S. president signed the treaty, and the president has the power to abrogate that treaty because it was never ratified by the Congress. And he's threatened to abrogate the climate treaty. Well, abrogate the Greada Treaty and all of the other treaties with the reptilian and manipulatory.
But that's the problem. We don't know what they agreed on. And unless we know what they agreed on, how can you feel comfortable allowing a treaty to be signed without your consent or knowledge as to what they're signing to give away as your freedoms. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So, if they agreed to let these entities take children and people for experimentation or food consumption, then that problem is not with the extraterrestrials, that problem's with us. And that those people who signed those treaties and who allowed those things to happen are actually criminals. And they are the ones who are signing away our lives and our freedoms. They should not be allowed to be in that position to do so.
And in fact, if one does research in this area, or when one does research in this area, you discover that the basic stand-down orders in U.S. law enforcement, say the FBI and all the way down to the state police, where there's missing children, they will not go after a missing children. And that stand-down order is in place at the institutional level ever since 1954 and the signing of the Greada Treaty.
It's interesting though. It's ethnic though. And it's more so in not in the favor of African Americans, and that's the highest number and percentage of people going missing. But they dismiss that. And I'm not saying there's. And I'm not just specifically talking about African Americans in general, but the data suggests that it's more so African Americans vanishing than anyone else.
That is really amazing. That's a statistic that I've never come across. The first
Look at the demographics associated to the missing people. The demographics is very compelling, and it suggests without a doubt that those people, that high percentage of those people that have vanished mysteriously and under unusual circumstances were African American.
That is a statistic. This is the first time that I've ever come across that. One possible correlation jumps to mind, and I have no idea whether it's valid or not, was that I remember being in South Africa at what's called Adam's Calendar, which is like a Stonehenge in South Africa, kind of amidst all these stone circles. And it's supposedly the place where the Anunnaki reptilians landed and began the whole subjugation and, genetic farming of humanity. And for the gold mining and all of that. So and somehow if the galactic trade is still carried out by the Anunnaki, then they would have gotten initially used to African Americans, and I'm not sure. Some of
no, but it was just it's in the reports that I looked at here in Washington D.C. and it's interesting that all the missing were African American teenagers. So it would have been different if there were a difference in the area in which the events took place, but understanding in what I'm saying in these objects and their trajectory being in the direction of Northeast Washington D.C. is 100% predominantly black. So it's well, I won't say 100% anymore because they're trying to change the demographics associated to it. But in the people that are missing in Washington D.C., they're all African American, all of them.
So that's why I asked if there were any COINTELPRO connection, because we know that there is a huge bias in COINTELPRO and in the depopulation program toward the genocide of the African strain. And intentionally, the nuclear power plants are located next to African American communities, and this was traced by Dr. Loren Murray, the milk from the cows that graze downwind from nuclear power plants where there's leakage of nuclear
Fukushima milk, essentially. We're talking Fukushima milk.
yeah, is sent to African American
Yeah,
neighborhoods.
yeah. You know,
So
they saw that there was a study, and the dairy farms in New Jersey and the cows, the dairy cows there, the milk from the dairy cows had low levels of radiation associated to it, which was the fallout from Fukushima, which they still don't talk about. That's more catastrophic than one can see, just by the fact that they're concealing all of this information, especially the fact that the water associated to those nuclear reactors was pumped into the ocean.
yeah,
And that water goes into the currents, and that those currents go around the world, and that circulates nuclear waste around the world, and that essentially poisons the planet, and everything that we consume is now irradiated. So it's a total mess here, and they're letting it happen almost as if they want it to happen because they need something catastrophic to hide the growth factor that's associated to the amount of population that we have on this planet right now. And what better way to get rid of people than to have aliens take them and eat them or whatever. But
yeah.
my guess is their lunch, dinner.
Wow. So it is a reptilian species type.
More than likely, you know, and I'm going to say something absolutely abstract. Genetically speaking, African American or an African's skin is a little more tender than a Caucasian. It's softer. So it's, if you're into tender meats like filet mignon, then what better meat to get than an African human?
Ugh,
So it's creepy, isn't it?
really?
But logically, it could be the only explanation as to why a certain demographic group is taken more than another. It could be the taste factor associated to them. They're more tender, softer, easier to digest.
Has the current U.S. administration or any other human government or organization addressed this issue to your knowledge?
You know, the only connect that I have right now to anyone in the White House is my friend Newt Gingrich. And I share my data with Newt, and I was hoping that Newt would kind of share it with Donald Trump, President Trump, because, you know, even though he is the new president, he is still 4 blocks from the White House, and my pool of analysis suggests that there's an extraterrestrial presence. And, you know, when I look at the trajectories associated to the objects, the direction in which they head, normally speaking, is in the area towards the U.S. Capitol building, which is in northeast, and the White House and the Pentagon, which is in northwest. So you can do the math and calculate based on the evidence that's presented the direction in which these objects are headed and where they're going. So it is without doubt, though, with undue certainty, that they're entering the airspace and going in those directions from portals that are geospatially positioned in Washington, D.C. airspace. And I'm saying that because the fact that I'm able to document these events as they transpire, and the direction in which they fly on a consistent basis, and the direction in which they disappear on a consistent basis. If you take all of those, all the numbers, and put it together, you can conclude based on the data, the general position or location of the entry portal and exit portal associated to Washington, D.C., based on the research that I've done in my fixed pool of analysis.
Right, exactly. And have you, are you prepared to walk that data over to the White House, or do you think?
I've made several attempts to put that data out there, and I make as many possible attempts to do it with different people. You know, John Podesta is a friend of mine. I knew John from Georgetown Law School, and, you know, I've been sending John correspondence, but since he was hacked by the Russians, we all know the position of John. John is a believer, believe me. John Podesta is a believer. John knows that they're here. But John is no longer in power because his party is no longer in power. So we have to dismiss all of those people that were factors and significant to those who were associated to the Obama administration. Rule them out. They're insignificant at this point. And what was done back then is being written out by the Trump administration anyway, because it was essentially politically motivated by those who were responsible for putting Barack Obama in office. But with all of the evidence that's presented, I'm hoping that at least they'll come to the conclusion, and with the help of the US government, which most of the data that I have is provided by the US government, is to take the US government's data along with my data and present it to them in such a manner that they could not doubt the validity of what's being said or what's being done in terms of the amount of actual activity and extraterrestrial presence that is indeed present in Washington, D.C. airspace. They can't lie about it now.
Because it seems like Washington, D.C. is a special focus of
it's where everybody in the United States who has a political feature person is positioned. So if you can convince people in the Capitol, then you can convince the people of the United States. But what's interesting is when I present the information that I had documented from the close encounter that I had at the U.S. Capitol building, it was the U.S. Capitol building that resisted that, not the U.S. Capitol Police Department, which I made the presentation to. The U.S. Capitol Police essentially said that on the night that I documented those objects, that U.S. Capitol police officers made the reports that they saw them. So it basically made them look good without making their officers look crazy, because their officers did report them. And I showed them the photographs associated to what their officers are reporting. But what happens to the data after they finish their analysis? And the detective that interviewed me did an extensive analysis of my material because I had to give it to them. And I gave it to them under the understanding that here is material that was documented at the U.S. Capitol building. And here is the images associated to a landing that I documented January 16th in 2002. If it was not for the U.S. Capitol Police officers that were on duty at the time that I photographed this incident, they would have completely dismissed it. But they can't dismiss it because there were other officers that saw them. But the problem is, what happens to that data? It has to go to a higher office, and that higher office is Homeland Security. Then it goes to the White House, and it doesn't go to the FBI because the FBI washed their hands to it. They don't want to be like the X-Files. They are all. If you try to call the FBI and make a UFO report, the person answering the phone will laugh at you. So you can't call the FBI building. They're not the X-Files. It's not Scully and Mulder here. That's completely fictitious. That's something that was generated by Hollywood. And it's not national security, because national security would rather deal with the wall in Mexico and the stem of illegal immigrants coming in through the airports and MS-13 in Mexico and El Salvador. They're more concerned with that than an extraterrestrial presence that's taking humans off the streets of the United States. They're not concerned themselves with that, because it could only be because of people like myself who are delusional. Or so they say.
Well, you present evidence and evidence that has been judged to be sound by the relevant law enforcement
The experts.
experts.
But that still doesn't matter, Alfred. It's more deep than that, because we have to sway the advertisers, the people who are running television, and the people running television, they don't want it to be, because they got a good thing going. They don't want to know the truth. They don't want people to know that our airspace is being inundated with extraterrestrial spacecrafts. They don't want to know that, because it has nothing to do with making sales. How does that generate money? It can't. There's no revenue base associated to it. It's called fodder.
Right. So then, what is a way forward? One way forward would be to have these treaties abrogated. I mean, to really just bring them out.
What are the terms of the treaties? Until we know what the terms of the treaties are, it would not be logical for us to abrogate it, because we don't know what was done, what was sold. Essentially, treaty means I'm going to sell something to you and give you something, you give me something
Yeah.
back. So, I mean, did they give us extraterrestrial technology? I believe they did, by the fact that we have these cell phones now. I mean, there's that connection. Everything that we have right now, even this conference that we're having, is being done on technology that was assimilated from Roswell.
Yeah.
So,
right. I.e., I believe that there were in 1954, the U.S. had two choices, or two different avenues. One was an avenue presented by a sort of a Nordic-looking race that,
the blondes and the blue eyes, the Aryans.
yeah, and they said, look, the only condition that we put is that as a planet you forgo nuclear weapons, and we can offer you a peaceful and prosperous future with positive technology. And on the other side, there was the reptilian associated races who offered technology, but technology of an electromagnetic nature, I think that you're talking about. And they didn't have to give up nuclear weapons, and they had the Bravo test of the hydrogen bomb scheduled in the South Pacific. And Eisenhower didn't have the power to stop all of the defense interests behind moving forward with the Bravo test and moving forward with the nuclear future. And so
we
that's,
opened up the can of worms, basically. We opened up the can of worms.
yeah. And so now we're further down with the nuclear. We're inside the electromagnetic future that we can call the internet, et cetera, et cetera. So people are still saying, look, you have to bust out of the electromagnetic internet. You have to go into the, future of light. I mean, there are a lot of messages now, and your message is one that's very, very strong. So we keep on reaching out with the same message that there was in 1954. We have Dwight Eisenhower's great granddaughter, Laura, who, we had her, and she here and as part of a webinar, and she says, yeah, I'll go into the Oval Office, but there has to be a movement really that goes in. You've got to abrogate these treaties to stop and step back. And then as a planet, why did we have to align ourselves with this dark force just because, the nuclear lobby, had the power, had some kind of dark power back in 1937.
Well, those who did it, they're expired, but their reach is still far going, and it's interesting. Those people who call themselves the millennials, the young guys, the young people, they're stuck to their little iPhones and little iPads, and all the information that we're talking about is not necessarily on the internet. So you're limited in terms of what you know and what you can say, but they're reacting to events with very limited information associated to it, and their reactions are not necessarily consistent with what a person who is normally educated would react in terms of. I come from old school, so I had to do things manually. And you can see behind me, I'm using technically an old school type technology, this telescope that I have. But the fact of the matter is that I'm able to capture these anomalous objects with this technology on a consistent basis suggests without doubt that there is indeed um, an interest by these extraterrestrials in something that we have here in our presence right now, and that's why they're here. It can't be for the fact that we can do this, that, or the other. It has to be more so for the resources that we possibly have to offer.
Yeah, and I think that at least some of the points that the allies of humanity people were raising, and that is to really resist this particular outreach and to insist on our human sovereignty and to take back, you know, our human sovereignty on the planet, which now has been given over to a planetary police state, to the surveillance state, to the NSA, CIA, Google state.
The two objects that were stationary in my scan the other night, what were they looking at? I mean, think about it. We're 100% stationary. What could they possibly be interested in to look that long? And northeast, the direction in which my telescope was focused, is Washington, D.C. So there's something there that they're interested in.
You mean in Washington, D.C.?
In Washington, yes. For me to get that 3.5-hour sample of two objects sitting there perfectly still, doesn't that make you think about it? Why would they be sitting there? What are they possibly looking at? What were they interested in on that day?
Well, you know, perhaps it was. I mean, Washington is known as the locus of many deep underground bases.
Yes.
And maybe there's a whole deep underground base complex. Maybe
there is, without a doubt. Just and everything that I'm documenting, it has to be there because, you know, for me to get the same things in a fixed airspace, you know, when you think about how random events are, like a meteor, or if you what they call a shooting star, which to me is not a shooting star but a spacecraft entering into our airspace, how random would that be? It's so the probabilities of you going outside right now and seeing a meteor fly by are almost 1,000,000 to 1. But the data that I'm generating suggests that probability is not as great as I thought, because if these are meteors, how am I getting meteors every night in the same airspace? It's not logical. A meteor would be random. Its point of entry would be random. It could happen anywhere, at any time. But I'm getting them in a fixed pool of analysis, which is a set airspace. So in this set airspace, if I get this activity, then, and I'm getting it constantly, then the first thing you have to conclude based on the evidence is that it is not naturally occurring. It would have to have a level of intelligence associated to it for it to be constant and consistent, because that's a level of thought which is constant and consistent.
Right. So where do you think this is all taking you? Where's this work taking you and taking us?
I know, and I told another person the other night that was asking me, since they know that I have the ability to photograph these objects, that why am I not asking them what it is they want and what it is their agenda is for us. And logically speaking, if I'm documenting these events as I am documenting them, then my next course of action would be to document those events inside these objects. And that's inevitably where I hope to be at some point, with a more open understanding that the point of which I'm documenting is to show these people the validity of what they're dealing with. And a lot of people have to see the alien for them to believe that the alien is real. So my point is to get a photograph of an actual extraterrestrial, not something distorted or out of focus like all the stuff that they're using currently that's on the market right now. And if you notice, all of the data that I presented to you is all high definition. So I'm going to try to keep the presentation in sync with what I'm showing you. So if I'm going to go on board these spacecraft, I'm also going to take a picture of their occupants and the technology utilized to make these things go. That would be my next course of action. As for the rest of these people, I don't know what's up for them. I'm diligent in what I do, and I try to present what I do to the people that are in position to do something with it. But we're dealing with a mindset of people that still are stuck on stupid, and they don't want to believe the validity of what's happening. So in their minds, in their mindset, they want to believe that what I'm photographing are bugs being lit by lights on the street. So that's how they want to keep it. Just let them keep it on their mindset until one of these objects lands in their front yard or in front of their neighborhood. In this case, it would be more like lands on a couple of blocks because they're massive objects, massive.
So how can people who want to follow your work and really become more involved?
Well, I would suggest they go to my YouTube channel, but if you try to subscribe to my YouTube channel, you can't subscribe. They're not letting anyone subscribe. They're not letting anyone buy any of the material. It's kind of weird. They've managed to keep a cap on the flow of information, and especially what I'm presenting, since they know the fact that I'm showing you forensic examples of objects that are in our airspace. Most people can go to my website, which is UFODC.com, but I have 27 chapters on my website, which is approximately 63,000 examples. Of the 63,000 examples, 5,447 of them are exactly the same. So you form your own conclusion based on the information that you're able to gather and look at on my website in high definition. None of it is the product of Photoshop. I use no illusion or distortion or anything like that to create a fictitious era of reality. Everything that I show is either, it's National Geographic standards. It doesn't have anything modified on it at all to take away from the validity of what's being presented. So they can go to my website, or they can attempt to go to Wilbur Allen YouTube channel, which is being gated by someone who is not letting anyone subscribe. But you can still look at my videos on an individual basis as they pop up, but you can't subscribe to my channel for some reason. You know, they know how to effectively shut you down on the internet level. But you know, what I started doing in 2002, and my website's got 86 million hits. It's kind of hard to put a lid on something that's got 86 million hits.
Right. Well, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing this today. Is there anything or any specific points that you had wanted to share today that you haven't had the opportunity to?
Actually, we did quite a bit in terms of extensive coverage. I'm open to other interviews. You are a friend of mine, and I've always appreciated that, what you've done for me. And perhaps you may want to have another show, and we can continue this discussion in a more extensive manner.
I really appreciate this, because I think it gives people a sense of what is really occurring, and so we would very much look forward to you coming back to update us, you know, on I mean, we're going to report this as top news. I mean, for us, that 37 people disappeared on January.
Don't forget to mention how the District of the Columbia Police Department is putting other kinds of twists on it. Oh, runaway teenagers and all this other stuff.
I understand.
It's too illogical. None of that makes any sense.
Yeah. Now, we're going to run this as a news story.
Good.
Yeah. And so, and we'll be sending you all of the links, and this will be a news story. So there'll be something of a news cycle, because this is about 37 young African American men in Northeast.
East. The total is more like 1,800 after the end of the year. So,
Yeah,
I mean, the number is phenomenal. And
no, no, you know,
each of them, how does each of them lose their cell phone signatures? Come on, it's impossible.
I
Even
understand,
if you're abducted, they'll find your phone.
you know, and I have a connection there. I'm actually a member of the DC bar, so I have a
Oh,
connection to DC. I mean, we're concerned about it. I can go to the bar association with this issue. Seriously, I can go to the bar association with this issue. To the bar association has a large pro bono section, so we can go to the DC bar with a pro bono question. We're looking for pro bono, some solutions here, because the lawyers are officers of the court, and all of the public officials in DC seem to be having the ostrich effect
oh yeah,
regarding.
they're hiding their heads. They don't want to be accountable or taken the fact for accountability for any of this. They don't want to acknowledge extraterrestrials. They don't want to acknowledge anything above the table. They wanted to keep it on the table, and they have to keep it solid and valid, something that would be consistently credible. And there's no credibility in extraterrestrials because they don't have the evidence, but I do, and
Yeah,
there we have a problem.
right. So what we'll do is we'll take this webinar and the news article generated by it, and we'll send it to places
Excellent.
like the DC bar, because I am a member of the DC bar, the pro bono section, and asked for a District of Columbia lawyer to be assigned to this, to work with UFO DC and Will, and and to begin to help to open some doors here
Bring the
up on
truth to
Capitol
light.
Hill.
Yes. Well, let's see what happens. I'm willing to present the evidence. Now let's see if these people are able to accept and comprehend the evidence. That's the question.
That's a big question, but at least we'll begin to get the ball rolling and move this out into. I mean, I'm shocked. I truly am shocked that 37 humans have
On
been.
specific days. See, that's the key right there. It's the dates and the events. If
Yeah,
I didn't have these objects on film and then hear, oh, these people would vanish on that date,
yeah,
makes you wonder, wouldn't it?
yeah,
So let's conclude that those people who vanished because of what I documented appear in our airspace.
yeah. Good. Well, and so we'll do this. We will send it out, and then once we get that kind of feedback, maybe we can have a follow-up, part
Let's
2.
do that. Let's see what happens. It's all about the results, the action and results. The
Yeah,
results and action.
yeah. So let's see what comes out of this. And thank you very much for bringing this urgent news to public attention. I mean, it's the first that I've heard of it, and I am in shock. And
Well, if I didn't show you the evidence, you would have been more admissive or dismissive of it because there would be nothing to show to present the possibilities. But here I'm showing you
yeah,
UFOs, and then on the days that I show you these UFOs, people vanished.
I understand. I understand, and it's because we followed Will Allen's work now for
A long time.
more than a decade, and
Yes.
we've had the in-depth interviews with him, and we've seen him at the major exopolitics conferences, and we've dealt with his work that we understand the rigor of the scientific method, and his understanding of the dimensional ecology that we're moving forward. So on behalf of all of our viewers and on behalf of the public safety, thank you very much, Will,
Thank you for having me.
for this. Okay, so until soon, until part 2.
Definitely. I'll see you then.